Hello, class. I realized that with the last lecture, I got a little bogged down in the details, going over the Sidemen work, chapter 7. Now, I'm going to try to speed things up a little bit so we can get into more of the readings than I got in last lecture. So, chapter 8 is where we're picking up. And chapter 8 is all about the question of intimacy and how intimacy changes when something is face to face versus when something is mediated through some form of technology. And so the question becomes is technology increasing our connections with other people, or are they somehow hurting the quality of the education? So this is a classic kind of question of quantity versus quality. Do you have more quantity of relationships, but are the quality, is it much less intimate, for example? So intimacy generally is sharing your life with another person and telling them your secrets, your desires, letting them really see the inner you. But then when you think about social networking sites, or as they're also called, social media, um, is something really intimate if it's posted for the whole world to see. um, well, it kind of decreases the meaning or the intimacy of something if everybody knows it, instead of just a small group, or just one other person for that matter. Now, there's been a lot of research on this question of intimacy and quantity versus quality of relationships. And we see that the introduction of social media and more technology in terms of how we communicate, it's a mixed bag, like most things in society, though certainly not everything. Some things are very one way or the other. But there are pros and cons to when we're looking at the role of technology and intimacy. So you want to look at Pamela Hogg and her research, where she's looking at it from a historical perspective and arguing that public life has become more and more, or excuse me, private life has become more and more public, starting in the 1960s with liberal feminism, second wave liberal feminism, claim that the personal is political. And so, what she ends up seeing is that social media creates greater connectivity with more people, but it's intimacy light, according to her. Stephen Marsh writes specifically about Facebook and argues that while connections to other people are increasing, people are feeling more and more lonely. We see this coming out of research in psychology as well, where you'll have younger people who interact far more through technology and through social media, who are feeling very lonely, and reports of high degrees of depression and anxiety, and not feeling connected with any particular group or set of people. And so these would all be kind of the downsides to the social media. Now, the claims that Hogg and Marsh make are empirically backed up. And so it's not just, we see this historical trend, this pattern that we can point out from the 60s on up. It's not just people kind of approaching this from a philosophical perspective. We see empirical scientific research being done on this as well. Sherry Turkle's Alone Together ends up illustrating that technology is actually becoming primary. Technology, even before the pandemic, technology was the main way we interacted with other people. Um, and face to face interactions were decreasing with time. with corresponding reports of lower degrees of intimacy between people who are thought of as friends. We're also seeing that people are oftentimes being pulled out of face to face interactions because they're oftentimes checking emails on their phones, texting, or otherwise not engaging in people around them, are engaging with people around them. And I see this all the time, or I used to, when before the quarantine and everything, when I would be walking around campus, I would see a group of students sitting together, and none of them are talking with each other. They're all on their phones. Now, of course, you see groups of people who are talking with one another, but the groups that are sitting together and all on their phones are far more common, just from my anecdotal experience. And Sherry Turkle's research would support that. Now, there is another thing to consider here. What about people who are lonely to begin with? Not lonely because they're so wrapped up in social media, but what about people, for instance, who are elderly, who are older, who have seen maybe a loss of their loved ones, a loss of friends to time, and are feeling lonely as the younger generations in their family are wrapped up in their own lives. Well, one of the things that we see is that technology can actually decrease feelings of loneliness, depression, and anxiety among the elderly. For instance, giving elderly robots. Well, one of the things that they do is they end up anthropomorphizing the robots, like having a little robot dog, and then they end up imparting feelings of social bonds, emotionality to the robot, things along those lines that actually do help the elderly, help them psychologically. Now, Sherry Turkle also takes a look at things like Post Secret. This was a website. I don't think it's still up anymore, but it's where people could go, and there are other websites that I think have replaced it now at this point. But people could go online and quote unquote anonymously post something that they feel really bad about, some secret that they have. And again, it's this question of, well, where's the intimacy in that? Just going on and other people saying, well, me too, that can normalize what you're feeling and what you've experienced, but it's not necessarily meaning that you have an intimate relationship with other people who've had similar experiences or have similar secrets. And so this is also a part, now this is coming ultimately from Michel Foucault, but this is all a part of the rise of confessional society. Make sure to take a look. I'm starting to get bogged down in the details again. I'm catching myself. Make sure to take a look at Nancy Bain and her research in terms of the virtual environment. And while she doesn't directly contradict critics of cyberculture, she does offer a very different perspective, talking about the multiplicities of people interacting online, breaking down social networks. For instance, LinkedIn, as a professional social media platform, can end up breaking down what would otherwise be rigid boundaries around social networks. Um, Now, one of the major things that people talk about, and this has been going on ever since, I mean, I remember people discussing this back in the 90s with instant messaging, and people going into chat rooms in the 90s and things like that. So, how much can you trust what another person says or tells you about themselves? Well, actually, about as much, you can trust them as much on social media as you can face to face. So, is there deception in social media and online forums? Yes, but not more than there is face to face. So, if you're on social media and somebody's done up their page to make them look like some jet setting tycoon, and it turns out they're really not that. Now, what's going to stop that person if you met them face to face in a bar, for instance, from telling you the same lies that they posted on social media? Nothing. And so what we see is that cyber deception is about the same rate as face-to-face deception. We also see that there are varying degrees of social abstraction, from face to face interactions to phone conversations to texting to social media. All of these are different levels of abstracting the self and abstracting methods of communication. And intimacy seems to go hand in hand. Um, Not only with more face-to-face interactions, but also with the technology. So, for instance, if you are already connected with someone, say a family member that you're really close with, or a close friend that you interact with outside of social media, and then you also interact with them using phone calls, texts, Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, TikTok, what have you, any of these, that actually increases intimacy. So it's not all one way or the other. So if you're using social media to meet new people and meet a lot of new people, then the intimacy is going to be much less. However, if you're using social media to stay in contact with people you already have a strong social bond with, then that increases that social bond. So, like most things, it depends on the context. And so, I mean, that's true of most things. Also, notice that I said people anonymously, quote unquote, with my little air quotes, right? Um, Posting on Post Secret or what have you. Nothing we do online is actually anonymous. It gives us the illusion of anonymity sometimes, but I mean, as you can see, even if you delete your cookies or your browser history or what have you, every site you go to keeps a record of your IP address. And unless you're some high tech person who knows how to bounce your IP address off of different locations, so it looks like you're using a computer that in a different country than you actually live in, which most of us don't know how to do. I don't think. I might be speaking for my generation and up, um, but uh, nothing online's actually anonymous, and you need to act like whatever you post online is going to be connected with you, connected to you. All right. Let's move on to chapter 9. Chapter 9 is looking at youth struggles and changing cultures of intimacy, particularly people born after 1980. So, just as a rough guideline, people born from 1980 to 1999, that encapsulates, generally speaking, the millennial generation. So, when you hear people talk about millennials, they're not talking about high schoolers anymore. You're talking about people who are in their 30s, people who are entering their 40s even. So I actually am a part of the millennial generation as well. And I'm going to be turning 40 here soon. Um, so keep in mind that that's the difference between millennials and Gen Z. Gen Z would be people who are born year 2000 up till now. And then we'll see after Gen Z what we end up calling the next generation. So there are three main differences that have occurred for those who are born after 1980. The three, you can read them in the notes, you can read them in the book. I much prefer you read them in the book, but let me just go through it real quick. The first one, many young Americans are growing up with diverse family arrangements. And so, where you have, stepfather, stepmother, stepbrother, stepsisters, you are more connected with maybe your extended kinship ties. And growing up seeing this variety, not only within their own families, but the families of their friends, ends up leading younger Americans to have basically a sense of greater choice in terms of how we organize our intimate relationships. Number two, Young Americans have grown up with changing gender roles as well. And we're seeing that the notion of traditional gender models, and anytime you hear someone using the word tradition, always ask them what tradition, because there are many different traditional gender models that are very different from one another. But one of the things that we're seeing is the younger generations, millennials and Gen Z, are seeing more and more women moving into masculine roles, as well as more men moving into feminine roles, and no, and both neither are really defining or thinking about their gender in those terms. So, for instance, among millennial fathers, you're seeing a great deal more child care and child rearing going into as a part of masculinity. Though the lion's share, that this is an important caveat, the lion's share of this kind of labor is still placed on women's shoulders, even among younger Americans. The question is one of degree. It's a much less pressure on women in younger generations than what older generations faced. But that doesn't mean that, haha, we've arrived. No, we haven't. We still have a ways to go for true gender equality in this sense. Number three, the last one. Young Americans are waiting until they're in their late 20s on average to marry or start a family. More and more younger Americans are wanting to get a college education. Many in the middle class are raised without that even being a question, whether or not you're going to go to college. If you were raised in the middle class, it's just, or higher, it's just assumed you're going to go to college. That's just an expectation. Um, and so we're seeing it's taking longer for people to get that education and then establish a career. And many are wanting to wait on starting a family until they're more established. And so this is, again, a bigger change. It also leads to more time to mature. Now, this is not necessarily a bad thing. We're living longer. Life expectancy is extended. And because of that, and because we're staying in school longer than past generations did, you're seeing that people are taking, or younger Americans are taking longer to mature in terms of psychology, emotionality, intellectually. Now, is that a bad thing? No, our brains aren't even fully developed until we're 24, around the age of 24. So, you know, it's not something to worry about. It's just a function of how society and culture have changed. All right. So, what about hookup culture? Um, Now, hookup culture is a difference in terms of dating culture. In the 70s and 80s, colleges had dating cultures. And this is where you get a lot of people doing serial monogamy and things of that sort. Culture of hooking up with a focus on increased sexual intimacies um, and is something that takes up less time in terms of forming intimate relationships. And we see that this works out better for younger Americans who are looking for sexual intimacy, but not necessarily a lifelong commitment from somebody. They're wanting to experience and explore their sexuality, but at the same point in time, not necessarily looking to form long term relationships until they're older and more established. Now, critics of hookup culture point to the prevalence of sexually transmitted infections or STIs. And STIs have increased with hookup culture than dating culture. I mean, not hugely so, but to a degree. Now, does that mean that hookup culture is inherently bad and causing young Americans to catch all these STIs? No. Again, it's a question of degrees. And the more sexual education someone has, um, the less likely they are to contract an STI, even in participating in hookup culture. And so it's not necessarily a hookup culture, it's people participating in hookup culture who are not very well educated in terms of sex and how to protect themselves and how to recognize symptoms of an STI, for instance. And oftentimes, the best policy, no, always the best policy is to use protection because, as I'm sure many of you already know, the prevalence of STIs do not always accompany clear symptoms that you would be able to point out. All right. Now, we also shouldn't overblow the issue in terms of how many people are participating in hookup culture. Uh, Empirical studies are generally finding that about 40% of women have participated in hookup culture by their senior year of college, which means that 60% or around 60% of women have not participated in hookup culture. So it's a sizable minority, but it's still a minority. The majority of people are not participating, at least when these studies are done. Now, these studies were being done before things like Tinder, Grindr, and these kinds of hookup apps were really popular. And so, if we were to redo the study, we'd probably find that that might be a little higher today, um, just a few years later. All right. Now, young adults after college, though, tend to return to dating culture rather than the hookup culture. And we see that they tend to take intimate relationships more seriously than once they've been more established. We also see queer students participating in hookup culture, as I mentioned, Grindr as one example of a hookup app. But they develop different ways of defining and determining what counts as sex. Now, this is something you started hearing first with the Clinton administration and whether or not oral sex counts as sex. Nobody ever talked in those terms really until that period of time. Oral sex was considered sex. But now the culture is starting to redefine what is considered sexual and what is not. So, in this sense, oral sex between women would count as sex in queer cultures, but oral sex between a man and a woman in straight cultures might not be counted as quote unquote real sex. And this is in part because of an inheritance of focusing on penile penetration of vaginas as being the definition of intercourse in heterosexual relationships. And so, I poke it at the Clintons and Bill Clinton specifically because of how he was trying to take advantage of this bias in terms of how we define sex. But this really predates Clinton quite a bit, by more than 100 years, actually. So, um, one of the major changes that we end up seeing for younger Americans is the number of women from middle class positions already moving into the workforce. Now, in the past, working class women and women living in poverty always had to be a part of the workforce. They didn't really have any choice. But now we're seeing more and more expectations that middle class women will also be in the workforce. Um, and so this ends up placing a lot more pressure on women who are reporting, particularly millennial women are reporting who have had children, being expected to be super women, where they're working a full time job, they are meeting all the demands of the job in a professional setting, but then also are expected to do the bulk of child rearing and domestic chores and things like that. Now, as I said earlier, more men among younger Americans are starting to step into those roles and starting to do those kinds of things more. But again, a question of degree, the bulk of it is still put on women's shoulders, even in younger generations. Now, Kathleen Gearson, take a look at her work, The Unfinished Revolution. And she's talking about the unfinished revolution, the sexual revolution, the gender revolution, the stalled revolution of the 60s and 70s. And found that most young people across sexualities, regardless of sexual identity, want marriage and a family. And so marriage and family is not going anywhere. Just as it extends well into the ancient past, um, it's going to extend well into the future. It's just that even those in the past, all the way up to now, are constantly changing. And so, if you do a historical research on cultures of intimacy and cultures of family and cultures of marriage, you'll end up finding out that there's not just one tradition, there's not just one gender model. It depends on what time period, it depends on what culture you're talking about, all of these kinds of things. We're seeing even women in uh, earlier generations, such as Gen X and Baby Boomer, starting to change their views on gender roles. And they've become over the decades much more aware of the dangers faced by women when they only define themselves in the role of wife and mother. Well, what happens if you spent most of your life defining yourself as a wife or a mother, and then your husband divorces you? Well, most companies are not going to look at homemaker on a resume and say, well, yeah, we're going to hire that person over this other person who has been working on a career all this time. Um, and so, since that is a real danger, you're seeing even older women and more traditional women, in the sense of 1950s notions of gender, are starting to change their understanding of gender roles just out of pragmatism, practicality. We also see that, and this is much more true today than when this was originally written in your book, men and women are facing an uncertain job market. And many men are feeling the strain of the gender roles, such as to find a job, and to find a job that pays enough to support a family. Um, there might be in the past, I mean, right now, we're seeing like 14 million Americans are unemployed, and that's during a pandemic. But even before the pandemic, when you had very low rates of unemployment, you still had very high rates of underemployment, where people are having to take whatever they can, and oftentimes working 2 to 3 minimum wage jobs, even with a college degree, because that's all they could find. But hey, they aren't unemployed, but they can't really support a family on that. So, we're seeing that men, as a result of this, are starting to reject the primary breadwinner role and focusing more on the emotionality of family and relationships. And about 30% of men in America actively report rejecting the breadwinner role as a core part of their sense of masculinity. Now, what about intimacy and parenthood among the poor? Now, there are a lot of stereotypes in America about the poor. And if you take my social theory class, we'll get into where those stereotypes come from. We'll get into the history of them. But like most stereotypes, or really all stereotypes, uh, they're false. So, let's look at people in lower socioeconomic statuses. Generally speaking, they want the same thing as working class and middle class Americans. They want economic security. They want solid relationships, marriage and a family of their own. They want to work. So this idea that if you're not in a higher class position, it must be that you're just lazy. The research does not support that at all. Um, because of their lower SES or socioeconomic status, they tend to approach these aspirations differently than their counterparts in a higher SES. And so we see that intimate relationships among the poor, those living in poverty, are similar to those changes that we see in higher SESs, where sex, love, parenthood, intimacy are divorced from the institution of marriage. Um, and also we see that poor families, despite stereotypes, generally only have two children on average. So the stereotype of someone living in poverty and just having all these children and being on welfare and having children to get more money from welfare, that doesn't work. That I mean, because children are much more expensive than what you get from social assistance. And not only that, but the more children you have, it's a reduction in returns. So the more children you have, if you're on social assistance, the less assistance you're getting. So it's built into the way social assistance works to have smaller families rather than larger families. I know you're all thinking about exceptions, and of course, there are always exceptions. In sociology, we look at social patterns and what the general patterns are, not necessarily what the outliers are. All right. Also, despite being eligible for social assistance, families in poverty, only about 50% have used available social assistance in the past 2 years. The main reason for that is the stigma of being on social assistance. Um, People end up facing pretty severe informal social sanctions from other people. I mean, the grocery store, if they're paying for food with food stamps, people take that as permission to be rude and analyze whatever the person's buying, and then talk about what car they get into, and then they just assume that car's theirs or that what have you. Um, but because of that, people who actually need social assistance but don't want to face the stigma of being on social assistance actually go without. They would prefer to suffer from not having enough. Now, this also hurts children in poverty, though. And what we need to understand is we need to stop stigmatizing poverty. Especially that would be one peg. Now, this is all multi-causal, so these things are all interconnected. But the social stigma of poverty, it actually hurts kids growing up in poverty and makes it even more likely that they will get caught in a cycle of poverty. Now, for women living in poverty, motherhood becomes a sign of maturity, and mothers are expected to self sacrifice for their children. Typically, marriage is not a viable option because of financial stresses. Oftentimes, people in poverty they get married, they have kids, but because the financial stresses puts a high degree of stress on the relationship in general, and having children on top of that adds even more stress. What we end up seeing is that people living in poverty are more likely to be divorced, leading to single motherhood. Now, this is a common misconception. The misconception being that single motherhood leads to poverty. It's actually the other way around. Poverty leads to single motherhood. If being a single mother would lead to poverty, then when we look at wealthy women who are not married and decide to go to an in vitro fertilization clinic because they want to be mothers, but they don't want to get married and they don't want to necessarily have a relationship with someone else. You're seeing high powered, wealthy career women who are entering into single motherhood, but they don't suddenly plummet from their social standing and class standing into poverty. And if single motherhood led to poverty, well, we would expect that to hold across cases, and that's just not what we find. So, for men, because many men living in poverty are not able to fulfill the breadwinner role for the family, they tend to embrace what used to be considered more feminine definitions of fatherhood that were typically more associated with motherhood, such as maintaining social and emotional bonds with their children. And so the idea of the absentee father, is that a real issue? Yes, of course. But we also see that the majority of men living in poverty um, are want very much to have a strong connection with their children and not be absent. And so that again is another stereotype. Now, are there unplanned serial fathers? Yes. How does that happen? Lower education rates. Education rates are tied to economic class position, just as other opportunities are tied to economic class position in the US. And so, if you have a lower education rate, then the chances are that you're going to have larger families. That's always been the case. The higher the education rate, typically the smaller the family. Now, when I was talking about poorer families having two children, tip on average. That's an average. Does that mean that there are no exceptions? Of course not. Again, there are exceptions. We also see then with the fathers with multiple partners, it's two children per woman, maybe, but the fathers actually have far more children. Um, and it's important for them to focus on being there emotionally because of their lower occupational attainment, lower educational attainment, and higher rates of incarceration. So, the lower your socioeconomic status is, the higher the likelihood of being stuck in dead end, low paying jobs, of not getting the opportunity to get to further your education. You probably grew up in an impoverished area of wherever you live, which means that you didn't get the best education to begin with, since most schools rely on property taxes for a big part of their funding. And so and then those areas are more heavily policed. And so something that you would see is diffuse throughout the population. For instance, do people in poverty use illicit drugs? Yes. Do people in the middle class or working class use illicit drugs? Yes. How about the middle class? Yes. How about the elites? Yes. However, it's mostly people in lower socioeconomic statuses who are found, who are caught, who are tried, who are convicted, and who cannot afford lawyers to get them out of trouble. And that's assuming someone in a higher class position is even caught, because they're typically not. All right. So in this way, and this is how this chapter 9 ends, children become the socio-emotional glue that holds families together. Children actually become the main focus of the family for both mothers and fathers living in lower socioeconomic statuses. All right, moving on to chapter 10. Now, in chapter 10, we're going to be looking much more at legislation and court cases, and growing state intervention, as well as the state's retreat from trying to legislate uh, intimate relationships. So here's the question: do American citizens have a right to be sexual? Well, that depends on which time period you're looking at. Because you have a right to be sexual within marriage, um, prior to the 1960s. But the latter half of the 20th century has been a story, the history of these kinds of things, the state removing these kinds of blocks on sexual rights and increasing the rights of people to be sexual even outside of marriage. Now, we've talked already about the moral reformers at the end of the 19th century and beginning of the 20th century who demanded state interventions from the 1870s to World War I. We see states responding with sexual laws, including the outlawing of prostitution, outlawing of abortion, outlawing of contraceptives, outlawing of using the mail system to send any information about sex or sexuality. Particularly, these were the kinds of things that Anthony Comstock wanted to achieve. Now, 1930s, we see the eugenics movement being in full swing. I mean, it starts decades before the 1930s, but it's really in full swing by the 1930s. We see 1942, Skinner v. Oklahoma ends up striking down forced sterilization of people arrested for non-sexual crimes. We still sterilize for sexual crimes. For instance, serial rapists. That might be one punishment that's passed down by a judge, is forced sterilization. It's very rare that we do it in the 21st century, but it still occurs some cases, but for sexual crimes in this case. It also, though, shows an outdated understanding of sexual desire, impulse, and potency, for instance. And so if a man is sterilized, the idea is that he's no longer going to have sexual interest. That's not true at all. Actually, sterilization doesn't do anything to decrease the sexual desire. It just changes the way that people express it. And so sterilization doesn't even achieve what it's intended to achieve in the case of sexual crimes. Now, this time period represents unprecedented expansion from 1870s to World War I of governmental control over sexuality and its expression. It was really in the 1940s, and that's why Skinner v. Oklahoma is this landmark case where you see the tide beginning to turn. And birth control clinics, sexual imagery, imagery for the purposes of education, as well as pornography, were all much more prevalent starting in the 1940s. Now, we see legislation such as the Moral Penal Code of 1962. Now, the Moral Penal Code of 1962, I know, sounds very draconian and almost kind of tyrannical, but it actually serves as a foundation for guided reform during the 1970s and 80s that saw sex as being a fundamental right for Americans. We see Griswold v. Connecticut in 1965 struck down the criminalization of the use of birth control among married couples. So up until 1965, it was illegal for even married couples to use birth control. It was not until 1972 with Eisenstadt v. Baird that this was extended to unmarried couples. So it wasn't until 1972 that you were legally allowed to go and get contraceptions like condoms. So, and of course, teen pregnancy was the roof, and the passage of STIs among people were also relatively high. All right. Now, if we back up a bit, let's talk about sex speech. I mean, some of the things I've said in these videos, I'm posting them to YouTube, right? Anyone can see them. I'm make them public, so anyone who has the goes and searches for these videos are going to be able to find them. And a lot of what I talk about and just educating you about the history of sex, the changing social movements, the concept of sexual identity and how that works would have all been illegal before 1957, which means that if law enforcement saw these videos and it was prior to 1957, of course, long before the internet was around and for us to post videos on, I most likely would be arrested. So the landmark case there is Roth v. United States, where sex speech in public is allowed as long as it does not appeal to prurient interests. Now we see that this is a really difficult thing to define. Prurient is something that's just purely sexual that has no other significance whatsoever. And it kind of gets at that the impossibility of defining what is pornography versus what is art. And oftentimes these kinds of things are in the eyes of the beholder, which leaves what sex speech is allowed and what sex speech is not allowed, oftentimes in 1957 anyways, up to local governments to decide. Now we see obscenity laws or the laws against sex speech being limited even further to material that is, and this is a quote from the majority decision of the Supreme Court, utterly without redeeming social importance. And this was a case in 1966, the Memoirs of Women of Pleasure v. Massachusetts. And this particular case, the Memoirs of Women of Pleasure, was kind of a theatrical troupe that would go and talk about women's issues and women's sexuality. And Massachusetts tried to slap them with obscenity laws to block them. And well, the Memoirs of the Women of Pleasure ended up taking Massachusetts to court and winning. And so we end up seeing obscenity laws that are even more tightly controlled and being taken away from more of the local governments. 1973, we see public speech rights expanding again, appealing to community standards to decide what is obscene, but still opening up things that have social or educational importance. And that could include things that are highly erotic, as you've seen with some of the videos that I've posted for you to watch in this class. But they are not posted for prurient reasons. They are just purely sexual reasons. They're posted for educational purposes, and hopefully that's what you all are getting out of them, because that's my intention. All right. So Miller v. California, 1973. That's the case that ended up limiting obscenity laws even more. Now, in this way, sex was becoming both more private and public simultaneously. It was more private in the sense that the state was stepping away and not dictating what was allowed and what was not allowed. In other ways, it was becoming more public because people were more openly talking about sex and sexuality. Now, women's sexuality specifically. Let's turn our attention to that subject. Now, historically, coming from the Victorian age, which we've discussed in an earlier video and earlier readings, view women as moral, spiritual beings providing a base of sexual familial power in the past. But this image of women depends on women being compliant with a patriarchal order. And this began to change in the 1960s, largely due to the work of second wave feminists, and in particular, liberal feminists in the 1960s. 1970s, as I hope you are all much more aware of now, there was this proliferation of different schools of feminist thought. And feminism is not just one thing, but is a huge umbrella with many different schools of thought and many disagreements and debates historically as well as currently within this really broad umbrella of feminism. So the first thing we're going to look at is who owns a woman's body. Does a woman own her own body, or if she becomes pregnant, does the rights of a fetus that is dependent on a woman's body for its survival supersede the rights of a woman? Well, before 1973, we saw that more than 1 million women per year were getting very dangerous kinds of abortions, where thousands would die because of sepsis or uncontrolled bleeding, or other kinds of complications that could occur from back alley abortions. So Roe v. Wade in 1973, that made abortion a right for women, is really about the ownership of women's bodies and who owns them. And so Roe v. Wade said unequivocally, women own their own bodies. We also see that in the 70s and on, rape became much more of a focus, and the issue of rape began to be combated both politically and educationally in terms of scholarship, with expanding definitions of rape. So, for instance, before this period of time, rape was largely something that was understood as this violent occurrence, and if a woman was not beaten up and needed to be immediately put into ICU, then she wasn't really raped. And feminists really started going after these definitions, both in terms of the social movements on the street as well as academics and scholars, and started expanding definitions of rape, such as acquaintance rape or date rape, and also marital rape. Now, for instance, the state of Texas did not recognize, just as an example, marital rape as rape until 1994. The reason being is that once a man and a woman get married, the idea is that the man is deserved sex from the wife, and therefore, in consenting to marry the man, she has consented her body to be used by the man whenever he wants. Um, and so in Texas, it was 1994 that marital rape made it onto the books as a crime. Here's the thing, you might be thinking, wow, that's really late, right? 1994. Texas was one of the early states to put marital rape on the books. Many other states it was much later, actually. So it's that saying, don't mess with Texas women, right? Texas being one of the early ones. Now let's turn to homosexuality and the fight for rights. A lot of this we've already discussed to a degree. But let's get into it a bit more. So, we see widespread institutional discrimination that was rampant well into the 70s, and even today. And often laws that had nothing to do with sexuality were used to destroy the lives of people who were gay, such as the cross dressing ordinance in New York City. And so the rule for it was you could quote unquote cross dress as long as you had 3 articles of clothing that matched your gender, as New York legislature understood it. Um, and so this was much more about gender performance than sexual activity whatsoever, but it was used to round people up, and ruin their lives and give them criminal records, just because of the way that they presented themselves in terms of gender. 1990s, we see many states passing laws protecting the rights of gay citizens. And Congress has still to this day blocked federal anti-discrimination legislation that includes sexual identity. However, the Supreme Court just recently struck a blow to that, and saying that discriminating against people because of gender or sexual identity in the workforce or workplace is now unconstitutional. The Supreme Court settled something that Congress has been deadlocked on for decades. Now, Because of victory starting in the 70s with gay rights, we see that gay rights resistance to gay rights and anti-gay activists have increased over the last 20, I would say 30 or more years, um, as a backlash to the legislative, such as they were, but particularly judicial victories of gay social movements. Now, let's turn our attention to race. And keep in mind now that interracial marriage was illegal in the United States because of anti miscegenation laws that were on the books in some states up until the 1960s. Now, this was not across the board in all states in the United States in the 1960s, but it was certainly on the books in many states. And for arguing that why anti-miscegenation laws needed to be in place, those who supported anti-miscegenation laws ended up arguing something around the idea of protecting the purity of white women. Without these laws, you would end up just having roving bands of minority and particularly black men reproducing with white women and destroying their purity and watering down the white race. This is, I mean, incredibly racist things to say, but these were the things that were being said in that time period to try to support anti miscegenation laws. We see that this is grounded in eugenics, local vigilantes like the KKK that still are in operation to this day. The eugenics movement can't really be said to have officially ended until the end of the Tuskegee syphilis experiment in the 1970s. And so even the eugenics movement is not something that's just in this distant past. Um, so we see that World War II and black soldiers who fought in World War II, who returned home, um, really were slapped in the face with the hypocrisy of how race works in America. So imagine this. I mean, you're a black soldier and you've gone on, you fought for your country in World War II, and you thought you were fighting against racism. You're fighting against the Nazis. You're fighting to liberate concentration camps. And then you come back home to the United States and you end up waking up one night with a cross burning in your front yard. And so many black veterans said that they weren't fighting racism in Germany just to come home into the United States and put up with it. And many of these veterans ended up starting in the 1940s. Some of the early underpinnings for the civil rights movement that picked up steam in the 1950s, 60s, 70s, and on. I mean, we still see the civil rights movement is not something that just occurred in the 60s and 70s. It's still going on right now. That's what Black Lives Matter is about. Um, so, 1967, anti-miscegenation laws were declared unconstitutional in Loving v. Virginia. What a great name for a case, right? Striking down anti-miscegenation laws so people can love whom they love, regardless of race, even though it took a while to get there in terms of sexuality. Loving v. Virginia, 1967. Now, just because there's a difference between de facto ways of things being done or things how they're done point of fact versus de jure things such as de jure by law. And just because you pass a law or a court decision has been passed down does not mean that what people actually do and how people behave are going to automatically change. It depends on whether or not the laws are being enforced or the decisions are being enforced, who is tasked with enforcing them. The Supreme Court actually has no power to enforce their own decisions. That's up to the executive branch to enforce the decisions. And so the question then becomes how patterns from the past are maintained socially and culturally, even though there's no legal underpinning anymore that is forcing it to occur. So let's compare census data in terms of interracial marriage. And you'll look in the notes, you'll see that I've replicated the 1990 census data that Seidman cites. And so we see relatively high rates of interracial marriages with European Americans until we get to Black men and Black women. So intermarriages with European Americans among African Americans, it's about 20, or excuse me, 20, it's about 12%. So 8% for Black men, 4% for Black women. Now, 2010, if we go through and we start looking at the 2010 census and look at interracial marriages, we see that 12% statistic only went up by 3 percentage points in 20 years. So in 20 years, it went from 12% to 15%. Now, does that mean that interracial marriages between whites and blacks are increasing? Yes, but not very quickly. And so cultural and social patterns inherited from the past are continuing to dictate in the form of a racialized sexual script who is looked at as being a potential romantic partner and who isn't. All right. Now, this brings us to chapter 11. Now, chapter 11 is much more about culture and how the culture in the United States has changed in terms of representation. So, who is being represented in films, for instance, or popular media in general, and who's writing those representations? Who's acting out those representations? Representation is a very important topic in terms of understanding the sociology of culture in general. Now, we see that there's a great documentary that I wish I used to be able to show it in sexuality, but copyright law has gotten far more vicious in recent years than it used to be. And now, even for educational purposes, I'm having a hard time finding a free copy to show of the celluloid closet. But the celluloid closet is really chapter 11 in documentary form. And if any of you can find it for free, please email me and let me know where you found it, because I would love to show that video in this class. Start showing it again in this class, I should say. So we see that before the 1980s, Hollywood would certainly give representations of gay and lesbian people, but they were demonized. It got to the point where if you wanted a villain in a movie or a TV show to seem particularly despicable, give them the signs of being gay or lesbian, and that ends up doing it. Where you would have movie theaters. Imagine being gay or lesbian and sitting in a movie theater, and of course, they're not advertising, oh, the villain is even gay or lesbian. You go and you sit down, and you're watching the movie, and you suddenly realize that you're watching the bad people in the movie or the show are all are all being represented as being gay or lesbian, and then they come to some violent end where the hero at the end fills them full of bullet holes or something, and everyone in the theater gets up and starts cheering. Suddenly you're not in a safe place. You need to get out of that theater. And this was the experience that many people who are gay and lesbian ended up experiencing well into the 1980s. They were seen as corruptors, pedophiles, rapists, murderers. Just about anything you can think of was ended up being attached to gay and lesbian identities. And just to make sure that I am not even accidentally furthering a stereotype. In terms of pedophilia, we find much higher rates of pedophilia among people who identify as straight than we do among people who identify as gay or lesbian. So the stereotype that gay and lesbian people are pedophiles simply not grounded in anything true. All right. Now, 1990s, Hollywood changed their position. And so being gay or lesbian was no longer what they defined as the social problem. Instead, homophobia itself was defined as a social problem in movies like In and Out, As Good as It Gets, things like that. So the problem was not being gay or lesbian, it was being homophobic. However, it was came with an enforcement of heteronormativity even for gay and lesbian people. So even people who are not heterosexual were expected to follow the heteronormative script of monogamy, dating, commitment, romance, and of course, not in the 90s, it was not possible, but ideally marriage. And this is the same time period where you start seeing gay marriage becoming a real political issue, particularly among older gay and lesbian people who were around for gay liberation, because they were getting older in terms of their life, and they were wanting to settle down and have families, and so the 1990s marriage equality became an issue in a way that it had not been before. However, this emergence of a strict adherence to a heteronormative script not only creates deviant homosexual people, but also deviant heterosexual people. Because you can have someone who's straight who doesn't fit the heteronormative script. And you see this in a lot of rom coms, even now, where there's a guy who's kind of this lovable rascal kind of guy, is irresponsible, kind of childlike, sleeps around, has a lot of different sexual partners in his sexual history, and it just took the right woman to make him conform to the heteronormative script. And then conforming to the heteronormative script is presented as a sign of maturity and that you've now grown up. And so, what happens to straight people who do not fit heteronormativity? What about people who are into sadomasochism or who are polyamorous? Then they're seen as deviant people, even as straight people. Now, heteronormativity and the how deeply embedded in specifically American culture, not just American culture, but it's really strong in American culture, is particularly aimed at women. And so this is why you get the man who's not following the heteronormative script, and then a woman who does follow it comes in and like tames him and helps him grow up and mature and realize the heteronormative script is the only adult way to have a relationship. Now, where did this end up coming from? It comes from Disney. Disney did it. If you look now, I know for those of you who are Disney fans, you'll be jumping to point out recent exceptions to the Disney movies. But if you look at most Disney movies, particularly those in the past, they all follow the same script. Helpless woman can't defend herself. A man has to come in and rescue her. The knight in shining armor kind of motif. And so we end up seeing Disney movies being shown to children, embedding that heteronormative belief deeply. Teen pop culture enforces it. The notion of prom reinforces it as well, all the way to the multi-trillion-dollar marriage industrial complex. So a huge part of our economy is wrapped up with the institution of marriage. All right, I'm going to end here, and then I will be trying to post the rest of the lectures for this class, for the rest of this, for the last week of class tomorrow. And if anyone has any questions, you have my email. Contact me, ask. Stay safe and stay well, everyone.